There are decades in history when nothing happens, and there are moments when decades of history happen. Very few eras prove this more than the Second World War. Over 6 brutal years, from the historic fall of France to the titanic battles of Eastern Europe to the rise of the current world order we all know of today, it can easily feel like World War II has written history for centuries to come. In this video, we will uncover the 5 battles that decided the fate of the Second World War. Number 5. The Normandy Landings. Also known as D-Day, the Normandy landings were the largest amphibious assault in history, where the official goal of the invasion was to fulfill the promise made in 1942 to the Soviet Union of opening a second front against Germany in Western Europe. The Allies were already thinking beyond winning the war and about how to prevent the entire European continent from falling under Soviet control. On June 6, 1944, over 156 Allied troops landed on 5 beaches in northern France: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, involving 5,000 ships and landing crafts, 11 aircrafts, and at least 12 different nationalities. Operation Overlord sought to establish a secure foothold in France and begin the liberation of Western Europe. With such resources allocated to this historic operation, with the future of Europe at stake, defeat was not an option. At midnight, 3 airborne divisions parachuted behind the beaches to seize bridges and disrupt German reinforcements. From dawn, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers shelled German strongpoints along the coast, while thousands of Allied aircraft bombed targets inland and sought to establish air superiority. In the morning, Allied troops landed on their target beaches and were met with a storm of fire and steel. Indeed, the Germans had spent the last few years building fortifications on the occupied coast, known then as the Atlantic Wall, with the specific goal of crushing such an invasion. The fighting on D-Day was one of the most brutal ones of the entire war, with some of the first waves taking more than 50% casualties. At Omaha Beach, the most brutal one out of the 5, some companies virtually ceased to exist as fighting units. The first waves there suffered as high as 70% casualty rates, but the scattered survivors, reinforced by later waves, were the ones who clawed out the beachhead through sheer persistence and sacrifice. The Germans, expecting the Allies landing further north, were unable to stop the invasion. By the end of June 6, all 5 beaches were secured, 156,000 troops had landed, and the Western Front had finally opened. Within 6 weeks, more than 1 million Allied soldiers were in France. Less than 3 months later, on August 25, Paris was liberated by the French 2nd Armored Division. After Normandy, the Germans were on the defensive everywhere, and the war became a question of not if Germany would lose, but when, and who was going to reach Berlin first. Number 4. The Battle of Moscow. While not only being one of the most gigantic fights in human history, the Battle of Moscow also marked the first time that the German Wehrmacht was not only stopped, but decisively thrown back in a major campaign, thus shattering once and for all the myth of German invincibility. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler had launched the biggest land invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa, with more than 3 million German and Axis troops invading the USSR. By October, the Soviets had suffered horrific losses, with millions dead and taken prisoners. It seemed clear to everyone that Moscow would now fall very soon. On the 2nd of October, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon, aimed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces defending Moscow that occupied the city before winter. With more than 1 million men, 1,700 tanks, and 14,000 guns, Germany was seeking to inflict the final blow that would break its enemy. The first 2 weeks of the operation were a massive success, with more than 600,000 Soviet troops taken prisoner or destroyed. The road to Moscow seemed wide open. Meanwhile, the Soviet situation was desperate. With millions of casualties since June and barely any experienced officers because of the previous year's massive purges, the Red Army seemed broken. What was not broken, however, was the spirit of resistance of the Russian people. Stalin refused evacuation and stayed in Moscow, boosting morale. The Soviets raised new armies, drafted hundreds of thousands of civilians to build fortifications, and called back the Siberian divisions after it became clear that Japan would not attack in the east. The Soviet Union would defend Moscow to the bitter end. At the same time, in late October and November, the German advance had slowed down due to the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud, overextended supply lines, and Soviet resistance. But by late November, the Germans had reached out to 30 kilometers from Moscow, where they could even see the Kremlin spires through binoculars. The offensive, however, was stalling. The troops were exhausted, undersupplied, and not equipped for winter. On December 5, the Soviets began a counter-offensive of massive scale and horrific fighting conditions. With more than 1 million men attacking on a 1,000-kilometer front, the Soviet Union completely took by surprise the Germans, who still had 1 million men in the area themselves, but undersupplied and exhausted from 5 months of continuous fighting. The Soviet Siberian divisions, however, were fresh, well-trained, and fully equipped for winter warfare. The surprise attack stunned the Germans, who had no choice but to fall back, with Soviet spearheads punching out to 100 to 250 kilometers deep in some sectors. Villages in the Moscow region became fortresses, and brutal house-to-house fighting took place on a gigantic front line. The cold also inflicted massive casualties on the Germans, and partisan resistance disrupted their supply lines. Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal at first, ordering his armies to fight to the last man. But by mid-December, the Germans were forced into general retreat. For the first time ever, the Wehrmacht had suffered a major defeat. The Germans fell back up to 250 kilometers, with panic spreading among commanders. The Blitzkrieg had now turned into a war of attrition, with an industrial superpower. Even though the casualties on both sides remain unclear to this day, they number in the hundreds of thousands. What was clear, however, was that the Soviet Union would not fall that easily and would become, over the years, the Third Reich's graveyard. Number 3. The Battle of Midway. The Pacific theater during the Second World War is often remembered as a bloody, years-long conflict in which the Allies fought island by island against the Japanese Empire, causing millions of deaths. The harsh truth is that all these years of brutal fighting, all those millions of casualties, stemmed from just 6 months of stunning Japanese victories. What the Japanese Empire had won in only 6 months, the Allies would spend the next 4 years to liberate at the cost of millions of lives. The Battle of Midway was the starting point of that process. After the infamous Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire gained the strategic window they were looking for by incapacitating the US and won victory after victory, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Guam, Wake Island, Rabaul, Bali, Java, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma, the main supply road to China, but also neutralized or destroyed every Allied fleet in the Pacific, all but one, the US carrier force based in Hawaii. If the Japanese could destroy this fleet as well, they could knock out the US out of the Pacific theater for the foreseeable future, hoping to get America to sue for peace and thus leaving their empire intact. The Americans, however, had something else in mind. US Navy cryptographers had broken enough of Japan's naval code to know that the Japanese Navy was planning an ambush at Midway. The US decided to gamble their last fully operational fleet and ambush the ambushers. The US Navy gathered its 3 aircraft carriers and positioned them northwest of Midway, where the Japanese wouldn't expect, with the goals of sinking the 4 Japanese carriers. This battle would decide the fate of the Pacific theater for years to come. On the 4th of June 1942, early US air attacks from Midway and carriers failed with devastating losses, but pinned down the Japanese carriers and aircrafts and kept delaying their launches. At around 10:20 AM of the same day, US dive bombers found 3 out of the 4 Japanese carriers, with their decks clustered with aircraft being refueled, thus unable to fight back. This was the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity the Americans were looking for. In minutes, the 3 Japanese carriers were bombed, set ablaze, and destroyed. Later that afternoon, the remaining Japanese carrier launched counterattacks and damaged one of the American carriers, but was itself sunk by US bombers once again. In less than a single day of battle, the Japanese Empire had lost 4 aircraft carriers and 250 airplanes, the very same that had spearheaded the Japanese expansion into the Pacific for the last 6 months, the very elite of the Japanese Empire's navy. In a single day, the course of the war was completely altered. This battle would go on for 2 more days and consisted mainly in the US confirming their victory by sinking more Japanese ships. The Japanese managed to sink the Yorktown, the American carrier that had been damaged on the 4th. The Japanese Empire, however, would never recover from Midway and would remain on the defensive for the rest of the war, having now to defend an overextended massive empire without the navy that had conquered it in the first place. Number 2. The Battle of Stalingrad. Famously known for being the single bloodiest battle in all of human history, the Battle of Stalingrad was also the turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. After failing to take Moscow in 1941, Germany launched Operation Blue in June 1942, aiming to seize the oil fields in the Caucasus and cut off the Volga River, a critical supply line for the Soviet Union. The conquest of the city of Stalingrad, the main industrial hub on the Volga, was personally ordered by Hitler himself, who wanted the symbolic win of taking a city carrying Stalin's name. In August 1942, the German Sixth Army, led by Paulus, reached the outskirts of the city, its advance guarded by Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian allies. On the 23rd of August, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, launched a massive bombing campaign against the city that reduced much of it to rubbles and killed tens of thousands of civilians. In September, the Wehrmacht began attacking the city itself, fighting house by house, room to room, factory by factory. The Germans had conquered most of the city by October, but didn't manage to clear the last remaining Soviet strongholds along the Volga, constantly resupplied during the night. The Soviets, however, had a plan. In the meantime, they had amassed a massive army of more than 1 million men, 14,000 guns, 1,000 tanks, and 1,300 aircrafts. And since most of the German Sixth Army had already entered the city, they were going to cut it off from the rest of the German war machine and unsecure it in the city itself. The besieging army would become the besieged one. On 19th November, the Soviets attacked the weaker Romanian and Hungarian flanks in the north and the south of the city. Within days, the Germans were encircled. 300,000 men trapped inside Stalingrad, cut off from the rest of the world. Hitler forbade Paris to break out the city and the German Sixth Army to surrender. He ordered his trapped army to fight to the last man while being undersupplied by the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, the Soviets were killing pocket after pocket, fighting room by room in a fierce battle of gigantic, historical proportions. The fighting conditions were among the worst mankind has ever seen. Starvation, frostbite, disease, temperatures down to -30°C, with every single room of every single building possibly being the place of the ambush that would wipe out your entire unit. The nights were short, and each day felt like a lifetime of suffering. On the 31 January 1943, the main remaining German pocket officially surrendered. On the 2nd of February, the last resistance in the northern factory district ended. The Germans and their allies had lost 750,000 men, with 90,000 taken prisoners and only 5,000 of them being alive after the war. The Soviet casualties numbered around 1 million. After the end of the battle, Germany had not only suffered a major defeat, but also lost an entire field army as well, causing a major shock in Germany. The victory boosted the morale of the Allies, coming only a few months after the decisive victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa. After Stalingrad, the Germans were forced into a permanent defensive posture in the east, with the notable exception of the Battle of Kursk a few months later, where the Soviets would also prevail. Number 1. The Battle of France. When you look very closely at history, you start to notice there are a few key moments in which events of truly historical importance unfolded too fast for the human brain to truly comprehend at the time. Moments where the fate of nations, and even of the entire world, was decided in a few weeks only. The fall of France in 1940 was one of those moments. In 6 weeks only, the German armies achieved a victory so unexpected and so total that it shaped the entire course of the Second World War. If the Battle of France had ended with a different outcome, if France had held the line, which actually could have been a very plausible scenario, we would live in a completely different world today. On May 10, 1940, Germany launches Operation Case Yellow. Paratroopers seize key bridges in the Netherlands, while German forces invade Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The Luftwaffe bombs key airfields, railways, as well as cities such as Brussels and Rotterdam. The French and the British move in Belgium as anticipated and planned in case of a German invasion. 2 days later, on May 12th and May 13th, is when the Allies and France suffered the first real blow. The German Army Group A, led by Rommel and Guderian, pushes through the Ardennes forest, considered uncrossable by French leadership for a mechanized army such as that of Germany, and crosses through the Meuse River at Sedan and Dinant. Guderian's panzer divisions establish bridgeheads at Sedan, and French counterattacks fail. Indeed, this area of the front line had been considered safe from German incursions and was thus left with little and inexperienced manpower to protect it, while the bulk of the French army rushed to Belgium. Furthermore, the French expected a repeat of World War I with an increase in defensive capabilities and standards of living for the soldiers thanks to the Maginot Line, and were therefore unable to adapt to the German blitzkrieg, consisting in breaking through enemy lines through a combination of precise airstrikes and armored divisions spearheading enemy defenses. On May 15th, the Netherlands surrender. On May 15th as well, the French front collapses at Sedan and the Germans start racing west, outpacing Allied response. On May 17th, German forces invade Belgium in force, outflanking the Allies without them noticing it. On May 20th, barely 10 days after the beginning of the invasion, German forces reach the English Channel, separating French, English, and Belgian forces from the rest of France. By May 24th, the Allies are encircled in Dunkirk, while Hitler hesitates and halts his forces. From the 26th of May to the 4th of June, Operation Dynamo occurs with 338,000 Allied soldiers, mostly British, evacuating back to England. In the meantime, Belgium surrenders on 28th of May. With the fall of Dunkirk, the French have had almost all of their heavy equipment abandoned to the Germans. At this point already, much to the shock of the entire world, the French army had already been virtually neutralized. In 3 weeks only, thanks to an unprecedented and rare succession of stunning tactical victories, the underdog post-World War I Germany had defeated what was considered at the time the strongest army in the world, France. The Wehrmacht was now unstoppable. On the 9th of June, the Germans crossed the Seine River. On the 14th of June, they enter Paris. On the 17th of June, Philippe Pétain becomes France's head of state and seeks peace. On the 22nd of June, the former World War I French hero signs the armistice with Germany in the exact same railcar in which Germany had surrendered in 1918. France was defeated, Britain was isolated, Vichy France was installed in the southern half of France. The great French army had been virtually annihilated, with all its heavy equipment ready to fuel further German operations. Within the following year, Germany would conquer almost all of Europe and begin its invasion of the Soviet Union, which would only be stopped at the very gates of Moscow. All of Europe falling under German rule within a single year. Tens of millions of people killed during the next 4 years that will last the liberation of Europe. Hundreds of millions of people traumatized, causing Europe to lose its will to power and drive to accomplish great things. A will to live and thrive that Europe hasn't recovered even to this day. The entire course of the second half of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st century. All of that because of one once-in-a-century strategic window opened to Germany by the historical fall of France happening in only 6 weeks. The single worst catastrophic defeat in French military history, secured by Germany when the Wehrmacht reached the English Channel and cut off the French military from the rest of France within only 10 days. The Battle of France decided the entire course of the Second World War and thus that of the next chapter of world history. If French leadership had taken more seriously Belgian and especially British warnings about a potential German incursion through the Ardennes forest, if French Colonel Rémy's warnings about unusual German traffic in this region right before the attack were not dismissed, if France had not only left the defense of the Sedan sector to weak reserve divisions, if France and Britain had not rushed into Belgium after the German diversion, if France had destroyed the bridges on the Meuse River instead of leaving them intact for the Germans, if French and British forces had evacuated the northern sector in Belgium and formed a defensive line with millions of men and all of their heavy equipment, thus turning the war of movement into a war of attrition, then it is actually very realistic to think that the Battle of France would have ended very differently, thus saving millions of lives, especially in Eastern Europe, and altering history forever. So these were the most important battles of World War II. I hope you enjoyed this video. If that's the case, don't forget to subscribe to not miss what's next. And if that is your will, I'll see you in the next one.